Welcome to our deep dive into the 2025 federal election. Conventional wisdom tells us that elections are all about trust. But in 2025, it's different. For the first time in our history, Australians are more driven by who and what they distrust rather than who they trust. Voters aren't looking for the headline speech or the next charismatic leader. They're looking for the safest option in a climate of anxiety and scepticism. Today, I'll unpack why distrust, not trust, will become the decisive factor shaping Australia's political future. Let's start though with the latest two-party preferred voting intentions. The first 3 weeks of the election campaign were good to the ALP, putting it in a commanding position to form government in its own right. But as we all know, in an environment thick with distrust, no lead is safe. One last-minute misstep or a final wave of negative campaigning could change the game. So while Labor's in a winning position, it can't relax in an electorate that's so volatile. More on that later. Turning to primary voting intention, it's neck and neck, but the Labor Party's best friends, the Greens, are quietly edging up. It's not that everyone's fallen in love with the Greens. It's more that disenchanted voters are jumping ship from the major parties and looking for somewhere else to go. This is a trend we've seen over the past 2 federal elections, with approximately 1/3 Labor, 1/3 Coalition and 1/3 minor parties dominated by the Greens. And all this is happening in and because of a climate of entrenched distrust. In fact, Australia has entered an era of distrust. Distrust is not an absence of trust. That's just no trust. Distrust is a very different and much more dangerous beast. Its trajectory runs from doubt to suspicion, anxiety, fear, and ultimately self-protection. Sound familiar? It could be a map of our national psyche, and Australia's levels of distrust have never been higher. Just look at the data. Since this research began 5 years ago, Australia has gone from a trusting nation to a distrusting nation. The green bars are trust, the red are distrust, and the black line is the net score, calculated by subtracting distrust scores from trust scores. So what we see here is clear evidence that as a nation, we've dramatically shifted from being a trusting country to an increasingly uncivil society rooted deeply in distrust. So that's the nation, but what about the governments running it? Imagine if, like everyone else, Roy Morgan only looked at trust. We'd have a positive story of steady and improved trust under the federal ALP compared to the final years of the coalition. But when we add distrust, which no one else measures, the picture changes. Distrust in Australian governments and government services deteriorated to its worst point in August 2024, but it's improved since. Trust has ticked upward since Labor's election, but it's not winning hearts. Distrust continues to dominate, and that's what will shape the election. Just look at the data. When we combine trust and distrust, sadly, we see that distrust is the clear winner. Once again, the green columns represent trust, the red distrust, and the black line represents net distrust. This data reveals that while things have improved marginally, it's in a sea of red. It's in a sea of distrust. Saturday's election is being conducted in a country riven by distrust, confirming that this is Australia's first distrust election. In every election, state or federal, I look for wildcards, that thing from left field that no one saw coming. And I found more than 1 million voters who could change the game. Now, this is not just a statistical curiosity. In a close race, this cohort has the power to swing key seats. Their distrust makes them unpredictable and politically combustible. Wildcard was the word that jumped into my mind when Roy Morgan uncovered a cohort of deeply disenfranchised Australians who believe their fundamental values are under threat and that they consistently get a raw deal. Their number has steadily grown from just over 500,000 5 years ago to more than 1 million today. Crucially, this group could reshape the political landscape. They're more likely to support the coalition or One Nation and significantly less likely to vote Labor or Greens. As we approach election day, the votes of these disaffected Australians could cause a disruption. More evidence that this is a distrust election. I'll have more to say on Wildcards later. So in a red sea of distrust, there are some green shoots. So who are Australia's most trusted politicians? At the last federal election in 2022, Penny Wong was Australia's most trusted politician, with Anthony Albanese a close second. At this election, Penny Wong's no longer on the most trusted politician list. In fact, she's dropped out of the trusted territory entirely. Independent Senator David Pocock has replaced her in the top spot, followed by Jackie Lambie, up from 5th place at the last election. Interestingly, at the last election, the top 3 most trusted politicians were all federal Labor ministers. 3 years later, there are no Labor ministers in the top 5, nor are there any coalition ministers for that matter. So why do Australians trust David Pocock and Jackie Lambie? David Pocock is seen as a genuine, principled and articulate politician who listens to his constituents, champions the vulnerable and the environment, prioritises the national good over corporate interests, and approaches politics with humility and a willingness to learn. Australians trust Jackie Lambie because she's seen as a straight-talking, honest and empathetic representative who speaks from lived experience, stands up for everyday Australians and veterans, and brings authenticity, integrity and a no-nonsense approach to politics. Crude but honest, as one respondent quipped. David Pocock and Jackie Lambie stand out for recording almost no distrust. While other trusted politicians do attract some level of distrust, they're more trusted than distrusted. Neither leader is in positive trust territory. The task for each is not to inspire, but to minimise alarm. The result will be heavily influenced by which candidate for the top job is the least distrusted. So looking at our political leaders, who is distrusted? At the last election, Clive Palmer was the most distrusted figure in Australian politics, but he wasn't a Member of Parliament in 2022, so that made Scott Morrison the most distrusted parliamentarian, just ahead of Peter Dutton. At this election, Peter Dutton has moved up to become the most distrusted politician in Australia, ahead of Clive Palmer and even ahead of Donald Trump. While not an Australian politician, Donald Trump had enough respondents nominate him as a distrusted political leader to put him on the list. Interesting insight, at the last election there were no Labor politicians on the top 10 most distrusted list. This year there are 3. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, and Victoria Premier Jacinta Allan. While Donald Trump casts a long shadow over Australian politics, he's eclipsed by Peter Dutton, who's both the highest distrust score and the highest net distrust score. This highlights just how deeply distrust defines the alternative Prime Minister, even in a field that includes some of Australia's most controversial and divisive leaders. Anthony Albanese, who's also more distrusted than trusted, has a far better standing than Peter Dutton. Viewed through the net distrust score lens, Dutton is 220% more distrusted than Albanese. And in a final nod to Penny Wong, she's now more distrusted than trusted, only just, but it's a long way from her most trusted status during the last election. With Anthony Albanese appealing to voters as the low-risk option and the least distrusted leadership candidate, what could derail his path back to the lodge? we asked Albanese distrusters why they distrust him. And we got a range of reasons for their distrust, including his dishonesty, avoidance of blame, opportunistic financial behaviour, divisive leadership, and policies they believe have harmed the economy, national security and international relations. We also asked Australians what would worry them if the ALP were re-elected. Responses ranged from a fear of declining living standards due to lack of cheap, reliable power. Critics said Labor's high-spending government will have little to show for it and that will be vulnerable to threats like China. Some fear a hung parliament that sees a Greens teal minority pushing socialist agendas and massive debt. Combining and ranking all of the individual responses, the chief concerns voters have for a re-elected Labor government are nothing, I'd be happy, followed by cost of living and housing affordability, ineffective leadership, the economy and poor financial management. Then with Peter Dutton, the most distrusted candidate, we asked Australians what would stop him from moving into the lodge, Kirribilli House. We started with his distrusters, asking them why they distrust him. They spoke of inauthenticity, his focus on personal power over real solutions, his negative rhetoric, his alignment with Trump-like populist politics, particularly dog whistling regarding key issues like racism. We also asked Australians what would worry them about the election of a Dutton-led government. Compared to Labor, the LNP has a laundry list of concerns about them forming government. Public service cuts, wasting money on uneconomical nuclear projects, no climate action, corruption and economic mismanagement. Respondents said the coalition plans to gut Medicare, undermine superannuation and focus on personality politics. Add in broken promises, inexperience and the fear of a rise in racist and misogynist attitudes. Australians have spoken their minds on what worries them if the coalition were to win Saturday's election. Aggregating the myriad individual responses into themes, nearly a fifth of voters said nothing would worry them if the coalition won. This is almost identical to the ALP result. Other concerns centred around the coalition's energy policy, specifically Dutton's nuclear energy plans and climate change inaction, Trump-style politics, rising inequality and dishonesty. So to conclude, what is my wildcard for the 2025 federal election? In a race already defined by distrust, a wildcard could come from anywhere. A domestic terrorist attack, a mass shooting, a very public domestic violence event may swing public sentiment behind the coalition. Or a single intervention from beyond our shores, a video endorsement, a tweet, even an offhand remark dominating the news cycle. It doesn't need to be strategic, it just needs to be loud. And in an environment this volatile, that may be all it takes. So this year, my pick is Donald Trump. What if, in the final week, Donald Trump enters the frame? A social media post praising Peter Dutton's nuclear plan flooding the news cycle. A video endorsement rallying the million disenfranchised voters and forcing both leaders to respond. Or a provocative comment that AUKUS is dead. A well-timed outburst, an inflammatory comment, or even a supportive comment about Albanese or Dutton could be enough to upend the final week. Trump doesn't need to mean it, he just needs to say it, and suddenly the election outcome changes. And that's a wrap. So to summarise, voters today make decisions based on avoiding risk, not seeking inspiration. In this election, the outcome depends on managing Australia's profound and pervasive distrust. One thing is sure, this is Australia's first distrust election. Thanks for listening. For a deeper dive into the leaders and parties, ask Roy Morgan or contact Julian McCrann. Thanks again for listening.